Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 46 today. We're going to jump back in and looking at Roman Catholicism, and particularly we'll be looking at developments in Catholicism during the 20th century. Throughout the 19th century, the reaction of the Roman Catholic Church to the modern world was mostly one of fear and condemnation. That's kind of where we left off, as the Protestant Church was kind of reacting to and even changing in some ways as a result of the modern world. The Catholic Church resisted that, but then now at this time, as we move from the 19th century into the 20th, that's going to start to change. The history of the Catholic Church until the second half of the 20th century was a continuation of the policies and attitudes set at the Council of Trent, mostly in reaction against Protestantism. So what had kind of set the table for the Catholic Church was not even really its own theology, its own evolution in theology, and understanding more about God's word and how to apply it, but it was more of a reactionary thing against the Protestant Reformation. And to a certain extent, you can understand that. The Protestant Reformation was a huge blow to the Catholic Church. The schism of the Catholic Church had already taken place between the West and the East, but that had been some time ago. It had been a long time since there had been any kind of thing where there was even a small group that split off from the Catholic Church, much less a very large group. So it's understandable that there's going to be a reactionary period, but it had lasted a long time, and the time had come finally for that to change. But there were those in the Catholic Church who felt that an attitude of condemnation and wholesale rejection of modern trends was both a theological and pastoral mistake. Sticking your head in the sand and just not even dealing with what's going on around you is typically not going to work out very well. During the earlier parts of the 20th century, these loyal critics would repeatedly express their opinions and alternatives only to be suppressed or ignored. Therefore, the history of Catholicism during the first 6 decades of the 20th century is largely the history of the conflict between those who wanted to continue in the direction set at Trent and the First Vatican Council, and those who desired to see more openness in the Church and more creative encounters with the challenges of the modern world. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, is a little bit about that, what happened that changed things. We'll jump on that first, and then we'll look at some of the theologians who kind of laid the groundwork for the change to happen. So we'll look at them in a little bit reverse order, but you'll see why as we jump into this. And we're going to start with the Pope that's going to get the ball rolling on this, and then the big thing that's going to happen to bring about the change, the Second Vatican Council. The election of the next Pope was more difficult than the previous one had been. When the election of the 77-year-old Pope John XXIII was announced, many thought he would be a transitional Pope. He soon distressed many by his unprecedented visits to the poor neighborhoods of Rome. So the Pope really wasn't, at this point in time, wasn't getting out just wandering around, but this guy did. John XXIII knew the degree to which the Church had cut off communication with the world at large. He would use his time as Pope to restore that lost communication. So this is going to be the first Pope to come around in a long time that's going to try to make a huge shift back to actually looking at what's going on in the world and being relevant in light of it, rather than just deciding, well, it's all bad, we don't care, we're going to do our own thing. It would take all his diplomatic skills, for there were many in high positions in the Church who did not share his perception of the situation, which is why things hadn't changed to start with. There were a lot of people that were very resistant to this. They didn't want the modern way. They wanted to keep the old-fashioned ways. And, if you look at it, is it always good to change because of what's going on in the world? Well, no, we know that's not the case, that you just automatically go along with what the world is doing. Obviously not, because the things of God are not going to be, it's not going to go along in lockstep with the world. But at the same time, you can't just say, well, I don't care, we'll do whatever we won't even consider it. So this is a Pope that's going to use his diplomatic skills to try to kind of move people that are really entrenched away from the old way, and at least consider, what there might be valid of what's going on around the world. So he's gonna make a big impact in that area. 3 months after John became pope, he called an ecumenical council. Some disagreed with this, thinking the age of councils had come to an end and that popes should rule as absolute monarchs. So thinking was, well, the councils are done with. The pope won out. Pope's going to set policy. He's going to do all this stuff, and we don't even really have to consider it. We don't need to have any councils. Well, this pope isn't going to go. He's just not going to go along with the flow on this. He doesn't believe that. He was a different type of pope. But John thought otherwise. He saw other bishops as brothers who he called on for advice. So the pope at this point wasn't calling people for advice, but this one did. He also believed that the time had come for a total updating of the church. So driving force behind the Second Vatican Council is John the 23rd. On October 11th, 1962, Pope John formally opened the Second Vatican Council. So this is a huge event in the Catholic Church, and it's going to set the tone for the modern Catholic Church. So it's important that we look at what happened at the Second Vatican Council. Few thought that this assembly would mark a radical departure from the course the Church had followed during the last 400 years. And in fact, most of the documents that it was decided were going to be dealt with during the Second Vatican Council had already been written. And basically, the kind of the conservative group that were at the top of the chain were thinking, well, we'll just bring these in and get them rubber stamped. And so a lot of people thought that's what all this would be. It's just, there'll be a little bit of some stuff, but mostly it's going to be just business as usual. We'll rubber stamp some stuff. And that is not the way it turned out. But the Pope had taken steps to lead the council in other directions. The year before, he had created the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity, indicating his seriousness in the pursuit of a rapprochement with other Christians. So the Catholic Church is going to try to reach out across the aisle to the Protestant groups that are out there, other Christian groups, and even the Eastern Church, and try to create some kind of rapprochement with them. And that's definitely not going to be popular. In his opening speech, John indicated that it was time for the church to respond to the concerns of the modern world with words of understanding and encouragement rather than condemnation. So again, a big change in what the church has been doing. These goals were further aided by the composition of the assembly itself. Only 46% of the prelates came from Western Europe, Canada, and the United States. So you're going to get the majority of people at this are going to be from around the world and not the Western world. And that's going to be a huge change, and it's going to make a big difference in what they decide to do. Such bishops were deeply concerned with the need to address the plight of the poor, to speak to the non-Christian world, and in general to speak a word of compassion and understanding rather than self-righteous condemnation. And it's easy to see why that would be. That's because that's the world they're dealing with. When you only have things from a certain perspective, and in this case a Western perspective, the issues are going to be very different. These bishops are coming from the world where the plight of the poor is a real thing, and not poor like in the Western world where many of the poor are still living decently. I'm not trying to take anything away from suffering, because there certainly is that, but not on the level of a poor person maybe in the Far East or in Latin America or wherever you want to throw. I don't want to get too specific, but just the idea of what the poor are having to deal with and how many there are, the sheer numbers of them, the percentage of the population, it's going to be very different from the Western world. So this is a different perspective. Also, there's going to be a strong secular world in many of these places, non-Christian, whereas in the Western world there's going to be a majority of Christian, or at least people that say they are. So anyway, just to say, the issues are different, and having that new perspective is going to make a difference on what's going to be focused on. Very soon, it became apparent that the majority of the assembly wanted to see vast changes in the life of the church, and particularly in the manner in which it addressed the modern world. So not going to be a rubber stamp anymore. The first document to be discussed dealt with the liturgy. Liturgical renewal had been one of the concerns of the previous pope, and many had come to accept the need for a renewal of the liturgy. The conservative minority sought to block the proposed changes, but they failed. So there's a small group of a conservative, really, really strongly conservative. They didn't want this to happen, but they certainly didn't have the power to do it. It was pretty much a foregone conclusion that it would in some form. the liturgy would be dealt with. So it wasn't as controversial as some of the other stuff. But again, there's still always a group entrenched in tradition to the extent that they're not willing for there to ever be a reevaluation or any change whatsoever. And that's an extreme side that's just as bad as the other side extreme that wants to change everything. So you get people from both groups, but they're going to be in the minority usually. And so the majority of people want to take a look at this and make changes to it. From that point on, the documents written by the preparatory commissions were generally returned for rewriting with instructions for drastic changes. So that's what I was talking about earlier. This preparatory commissions, they had already pre-written the documents. So, wasn't a lot of thinking involved. Just vote them in and rubber stamp it. Yeah, there may be a little tweak here or there. Well, that's not what happened. They took those documents and they put them into these committees and they rewrote them and drastically changed them. And so that's not what was expected. That's not what the powers that be had thought was going to happen, except for the actual biggest authority, the Pope himself, who had every intention that would happen, and he made sure that it did. Pope John did not live to see his council issue its first document. He died in June 1963. So this Pope got things started, John the 23rd, but he certainly wasn't there to see it finished out, and wasn't even there to see the first of these documents that are going to come out be published. But he did his job. He got the ball rolling. He got the council going, and the momentum is going to carry it from this point on, even through the next Pope, who, while he certainly didn't try to shut it down, he was also way more conservative than Pope John the 23rd. So let's look at what happened then. The next Pope, Paul VI, almost immediately declared his intention that the council would continue its work. When the second session opened on September 29th, 1963, he called those present to build a bridge between the church and the modern world. So the next Pope, Paul VI, is going to come along, and he is going to continue the work. There were some in the conservative group who thought, well, this Pope's more conservative, so he's just going to shut this whole thing down. Well, he couldn't do that. The toothpaste was already out of the tube. To just shut it down would have created tremendous problems. You're going to have to push on through. So he comes in, immediately says, yes, we're going to keep going. And he makes a speech that he wants to build a bridge between the church and the modern world. So the Pope's willing to go along with this, but he is going to be more conservative. So some of the things that the Second Vatican Council wanted to do, that if the previous Pope had lived a little longer, they may have gotten through even more progressive stuff, but as it turned out, that didn't happen. The council was encouraged to continue their work. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy authorized the use of the vernacular languages to a degree not permitted before. The third session of the council started on September 14th, 1964. The council issued documents on the church, the Eastern churches, and ecumenism. So these documents are going to be rewritten. They would have already been previously written, most of them. They're going to be rewritten, and they're going to be more progressive than what was originally intended in all cases. Many were distressed when, after the council had emphasized the centrality of Christ, the Pope declared the Virgin Mary to be the mother of the church. So this council is going to be one that's going to be more willing to consider some of the points that the Protestant Reformation brought out, and rather than the Council of Trent, which just went against every point of it, they're gonna actually look at it, and they're gonna try to go along with the legitimate things. Now they're not going to go turn themselves into the Protestant Church, obviously, but they're at least willing to consider the fact that there may be some of this that was valid. And one of the things is the centrality of Christ, how important it is for Christ to be the emphasis. So they really wanted to make a strong push on that, and they did. But the Pope he decided that he's more conservative. He decided that he was going to do something to disrupt that somewhat. And so he, on his own initiative, declared the Virgin Mary to be the mother of the church. So that's taken away from Christ, putting it back on somebody else, Mary in this case, and kind of in a little way derailed what the council was trying to do. So there's some things going on even with a pope that was willing to go through with it, he's not going to go through with everything, and he's certainly going to do what he can to limit how progressive this group gets. And again, they still got a lot of stuff right. They still got a lot of stuff, very important things done. But had the previous pope been alive throughout the process, they probably would have got a little bit more done. On September 14th, 1965, the council gathered for its fourth and last session. There was bitter debate on the document on religious freedom, which was opposed by conservatives from nations where Catholics were in the majority. So this religious freedom, we'll look a little bit more into what it said. But Catholics that are coming from nations where they're in the majority are going to be against this, because it's more likely that people are going to be Catholic, and it's easier to enforce everybody has to be Catholic, because basically everybody is. Well, a lot of these people aren't from nations like that. They're from nations where actually the Catholic Church is in the minority, and they need religious freedom in order to be able to continue to do what they're doing and worship. So you got two groups from two different worlds that are not going to see eye to eye on this issue, because they are seeing it in light of their own situation, which is what we do. That's not a criticism. That's the way that you're going to evaluate things. You're going to always, probably your first reaction is going to be one of, what's going to be better for myself. Now you can be selfless, but that's still going to be where you start from for the most part. And that's what's going to happen here. And so these groups aren't going to see eye to eye on this. But again, the progressive group's going to win out on that one. But when the opposition failed, the council issued fairly progressive documents on bishops, priests and their formation, the laity, the church and non-Christians, and missionary activity. So progressivism is going to win out over conservatism in this case. The document on religious freedom declared that the religious freedom of individuals as well as of groups must be respected, and that all religious groups have the right to organize according to their own principles. Again, you look at that statement and you can see it good or bad depending on your situation. If you're in a place where the vast majority of people are Christians, you may not love that, because basically what you're doing then is you're opening the door for non-Christian groups to be supported, and maybe even in a way you may feel like for yourself you are, kind of giving them a stamp of approval. However, understand that many of these people came from nations where they were in the minority. Some of them were fighting for religious freedom, or would be. And they're going to see this differently, because they're going to see it in light of, we need religious freedom where we're from, because if we don't have it, then we're done. And as a church, how can we sit here and say that it's wrong to have religious freedom, but then expect a nation to allow us to be able to practice our Catholic faith? You really can't do both. So perspective and your own situation is going to have a lot to do with the positions that you hold. We'd all like to think that we are completely without baggage when it comes to our understanding of God's word, that we look at it with completely pure and clean eyes and don't have any kind of things in the back of our mind as far as what it means and how to apply it. And when it comes to issues like this. But the truth is that we're all going to be influenced by our own situation. That's just human nature. It's not a criticism. It's the way things are. You can overcome that, but it's going to be the place you start from. And obviously with both of these groups, they did. And so it's going to be a point of contention. On Christianity and Judaism, the council rejected much traditional prejudice against the Jews and acknowledged the unique connection between the faith of the church and that of Israel. So a big step for Christianity there for a long time. Christianity, and even more so at some times than others, and even more so with some Christian leaders than others, but in general were kind of prejudiced against the Jews. They didn't have a really good attitude against Jewish people, and the Catholic Church wanted to acknowledge that that was not right. And any kind of prejudice that they contributed to or outright were involved in, that was wrong. And it needed to be put to the side, put in the past, confessed, and moved on from. And then they also wanted to make the obvious connection between God and Israel that we see throughout the entire Old Testament and up in the New Testament. So a good step forward in the right direction for the Catholic Church on that one too. The pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world is the longest document ever issued by a council. It sets a tone that is drastically different from the 19th century. It shows genuine openness to the positive aspects of modernity and deals creatively with family life, economic and social issues, politics, technology and science, and the significance and diversity of human culture. So this is the statement by the council on kind of acknowledging that they hadn't done what they were supposed to do as far as the modern world goes, but now that's going to change, and they make a big statement to make that point. By the time the council adjourned, it was clear that the Catholic Church had entered a new epoch in its history. So it's a big shift, but it didn't just happen at a council. There's most of this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's things that go on behind the scenes, maybe even years before. And as we're going to see, that's certainly the case here with the Second Vatican Council. But before we look into that, let's move on to the next pope, because this is going to be a biggie. This is Pope John Paul II. In 1978, John Paul II became the first non-Italian pope since the 16th century. During the pontificate of John Paul II, several issues that had long been brewing came to the foreground. So we'll talk about a few of those. One of these was the accusation of rampant sexual abuse, including sexual abuse of children leveled at the clergy. Damages awarded by the courts in North America and Europe forced the Catholic Church to pay enormous sums to those who had suffered abuse, and the Pope named a special commission to investigate such matters in the U.S. and to set policy for dealing with sexual abusers. So we all know, if you're up on anything to do with the church and the Catholic Church or the church in general, that there's a large number of people that have come out and made accusations against leaders in the Catholic Church as far as being abused sexually, and primarily in that group it's going to be child sexual abuse. And that's something now that it was fought for a long time that not come out into the public, but now we know that it's very much out there. We all know about it. But let me say this: we focus in on the Catholic Church, and rightly so, because there's been a ton of abuse there. But it's not just the Catholic Church that has leadership that is sexually abusive to people, and even minors. Protestant churches do that too, and you see more of individual ministers, pastors being called out rather than whole denominations necessarily. But it's not just a Catholic issue. That's what I want to say. It's unfortunate, and it's worse than unfortunate. It's absolutely disgusting and a travesty that this is happening in churches, but it has. Now, churches have gotten better about protecting minors by setting policies to at least do background checks and that kind of thing on people, and have a system in place to keep adults from being one-on-one with a kid. That has improved things, and praise the Lord that it has, but there's still abuses out there that are taking place currently or have taken place in the past that have not been dealt with. And it's very disgusting. It's very sick. But I don't want to sit here and make it seem like it's only the Catholic Church, because it has not been. And we're finding out more every day about different churches, whatever denomination, whether it be Catholic or some Protestant denomination. But you've got leadership that's involved in abusing children. That's absolutely unacceptable, and it needs to be pointed out, and it needs to be brought into the light. There was also the issue of women's ordination, which had come to the foreground among Protestants in the second half of the 20th century. In 1995, 500,000 Catholics in Austria signed a petition for the ordination of women and against the requirement of celibacy for the priesthood. The Pope remained staunchly opposed to all of this. So what we're going to get to with this is John Paul II. In some ways, he's looked at it as being very progressive, and some not liking him necessarily because of that. But then in some ways, he's very traditional, and this is one of them. He's not going to back down on the women being ordained, and he's not going to back down on celibacy for the priesthood. So just a couple of examples, but they're more than that. Also, under his leadership, the Roman Catholic Church reaffirmed its condemnation of abortion at a time which several traditionally Catholic nations were legalizing it. So They stuck to their guns there, which I agree with that, and I'm glad. But John Paul II spoke strong words on the plight of the poor and the injustice of their oppression. He issued directives against priests holding political office, but also insisted that the church be involved in issues of justice. So he's not going to be a pope that's pigeonholed. He's going to look at things differently depending on the situation. And he may go with a conservative viewpoint, or he may go for the more progressive viewpoint. He's going to do both, but he's going to consider all sides first. Therefore, he was characterized both as conservative and as progressive, depending on the vantage point of the observer and the matter at issue. So just some things about Pope John Paul II. John Paul II died in 2005 and was succeeded by Benedict XVI. So Pope John II, very influential. Some of you, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, he was the pope that you probably know best and know most about. He was a very visible pope. And again, he was a controversial figure. There were those who said he was way too conservative and those who said he was way too progressive. And in some ways, if you got both sides upset with you, you're probably doing things pretty well. So very, very influential pope. But now let's move into looking at some of the theologians who laid the groundwork for the Second Vatican Council. And we'll look at this in light of theological developments that are happening leading up to that council forming. The openness of the Second Vatican Council surprised the world, but the theological work that led to it had been taking place for half a century, so it didn't just happen at one time. There were a number of theologians whose work was either rejected or ignored by the Vatican, so we'll talk about a few of those. Probably the most original of these was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. At an early age, Teilhard decided to join the Jesuits. He was ordained a priest in 1911. After World War I, he was admitted as a full member of the Society of Jesus, and in 1922 completed his doctorate in paleontology. He had always been interested in the theory of evolution as a scientific way of understanding the inner workings of God's creative power. His first writings on the relation between faith and evolution brought swift condemnation from Rome. He was prohibited from publishing further works on theology and was sent to work in China. So he's kind of like, let's shuffle this man off to China. We won't have to fool with him anymore. And he didn't publish any more of his works. He was told not to do it, and he was obedient to that. But it didn't mean he didn't write anymore. But his ban did not prohibit him from writing. Therefore, while pursuing his paleontological work in China, he also continued his theological work. In 1955, after his death, his friends published his works, which immediately won wide attention. While accepting the general principles of the theory of evolution, Teilhard rejected the proposal that the survival of the fittest is the guiding force behind evolution. Instead, he proposed the cosmic law of complexity and consciousness, a pull in evolution toward the more complex and the more highly conscious. Thus, what we see at any given stage of evolution is a number of organisms that represent different stages or spheres in the evolutionary process. And this is a very generalized statement about what he was into. And if you want to go and study it more, it is extremely complex. I read it, and I'm kind of, what material I had to read is kind of hard to understand it, honestly. But you could read better stuff, and I'm sure you would be able to understand it if you're interested in that. But I'm just telling you, I'm trying to boil this down in a very easy to understand format, but there's a whole lot more to it than what's in this. The omega point of the evolutionary process is Jesus Christ. In him is a new stage of evolution, the final stage named the Christosphere. Just as humanity and divinity are perfectly united in Christ, in the end, each of us will be perfectly united with God while also perfectly ourselves. Thus, Teilhard combined science with theology and even with a strong mystical inclination. So this is a big guy as far as theology at this point in time. Definitely some way different thinking that had come from the past, but he's trying to rectify faith and past theological positions with modern understanding of science and that kind of thing. So he does a lot of work. You can agree or disagree with it, but he does work very hard to try to do that. And he's going to be very influential as a result. Now let's look at the next guy that's going to really be influential. Henri de Lubac was also a French Jesuit and a friend of Teilhard's. Together with Jean Danilou, de Lubac edited a voluminous series of ancient Christian writings. De Lubac's views were silenced by mid-century, but the ban was lifted, and his fellow Jesuits asked him to write a critique of the work and thought of Teilhard de Chardin, evaluating it in the light of Catholic tradition. He published the first volume of this project in 1962. Rome reacted against it immediately, stopping the project and forbidding the republication in translation of the volume already published. De Lubac was not as inclined to grand cosmic views as Teilhard. This, together with his profound knowledge of early Christian tradition, resulted in his having greater impact on Catholic theology. But he too believed that all of humanity has a single goal, and that the whole of history can best be understood from the vantage point of this goal, which is none other than Jesus Christ. The Church, as the mystical body of Christ, is a sacrament in the midst of the world. Although silenced by Rome, de Lubac was much admired by many theologians and progressive bishops. He was one of the experts whose participation in the Second Vatican Council did much to influence the outcome of that assembly. His very notion of the Church as a sacrament in the world stands at the root of the Council's concern that its documents reflect a church open to the world. So de Lubac is going to be very influential in getting things going with the Second Vatican Council as well as Teilhard. And so let's look at the last one that's going to be the most influential one of them all. Probably the most influential Catholic theologian of the 20th century was the Jesuit Karl Rahner. The son of a German high school teacher, Rahner wrote more than 3,000 books and articles. These deal with the most technical matters in theology as well as with everyday questions. In all he wrote, Rahner's method was similar. He affirmed both tradition and the modern world, and thus asked of tradition very different questions than were usually asked of it. Philosophically, he drew from both Thomas Aquinas and from his professor Martin Heidegger, one of the foremost proponents of existentialism. He repeatedly offered interpretations of tradition that were at variance with commonly held views, but he was never silenced by Rome. So he's going to get along with the Catholic Church a little bit better than some of these others, but he's still going to be promoting some ideas that the Catholic Church wasn't promoting at the time he wrote them. His influence on the Second Vatican Council had its greatest impact on the understanding of the role of the episcopacy. For generations, the tendency within Roman Catholicism had been toward a greater centralization in Rome. Rahner explored the notion of the episcopate and underlined the collegial nature of the episcopacy. This in turn meant that the church could be truly Catholic, adapting to itself to each culture and not necessarily taking Roman and Western European perspectives as the standards of truth. So Rahner's a man for his time. He's looking out across the world, and he sees there's a lot of different ways of looking at things that are going to be influenced by where you're coming from. And it's not okay, and it's not going to work out that just the Western world is represented in that thinking. There's going to have to be an expansion to include these other cultures that are coming in. And so he's going to be a big proponent for that, and it's going to make a huge impact on the Second Vatican Council. After centuries of refusing to deal with the challenges of the modern world by any means besides confrontation and condemnation, during the latter half of the 20th century, Roman Catholicism opened up a dialogue with the world. So the big change, a big shift during the 20th century for the Catholic Church. Long before the Second Vatican Council, theologians whom Rome viewed with mistrust were paving the way for this unexpected development. So that's looking at Catholicism and the huge shift that takes place after the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, and into that latter half of the 20th century. There's going to be a huge change, and it's going to put the Catholic Church in a whole lot different light as it pertains to dealing with the modern world. So we're going to stop right there for today. Thanks for taking time with me again today. Next week, we'll jump back into looking at the Protestant church during the same time period and look at some things about that. So I hope you can join me then. In the meantime, hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.